Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, sponsored by the Northwest ATTC, the Pacific Southwest ATTC, and the Western States node of the NIDA Clinical Trials Network. I'm Riley Vest, and I'll be your host for today. We are very excited to have Dr. Natania Crane from UIC Recovery Clinic here to talk to us today about cannabis use and mental health. Just a couple of quick housekeeping things. First, if you have any questions for Dr. Crane during the presentation, you can put them in the chat and we will answer them throughout the presentation as well as after the talk. You'll also be getting an email at the end of today's webinar that has a link to a survey in it, and we ask that you please take that survey as it helps us to make sure that we continue to bring you content that you're interested in. That email will also have a link to download the slides from today and a link to the Northwest ATTC website where you'll be able to find a recording of the webinar later this week. Additionally, when you registered for today's session, you marked the type of CE or CME credits you were interested in. For CME credits, you'll receive an email with instructions on how to log into the Stanford CME portal, as well as some other instructions. And this slide just has some information about the CME accreditation. If you selected one of the types of CE credits, you'll receive an email shortly after the session with instructions on how to receive those. And all this information is in the slides, so there's no need to write anything down right now. Those of you who requested a certificate of attendance will receive that automatically via email in about a week. Okay, so now on to the webinar. Today's speaker, Dr. Crane, is an assistant professor of psychiatry and the associate director of the UIC Recovery Clinic. She is a licensed clinical psychologist. Her research utilizes multiple methods, i.e. fMRI, EEG, cognitive, clinical, and self-report measures, to examine the brain and behavioral risk factors and consequences of substance use disorders, especially cannabis use disorder. An important aspect of her research is studying the relationship between clinical mental health factors and substance use, particularly between depression and cannabis use. Dr. Crane has received numerous awards, including a K23 Early Career Development Award from the National Institute on Drug Abuse. Welcome, Dr. Crane.
Thank you. I had a hard time finding my mute button. It moved. Well, thank you all for coming today. It's really a pleasure to talk about cannabis and mental health. Ever since I first started learning about cannabis and the endocannabinoid system, I have really kind of found that that's my scientific love, and so many of the patients I see use cannabis and or maybe have problems with cannabis use, and so I'm really excited to be here to talk to you about what we know today. It looks like someone raised their hand. Lisa. I don't know if I'm saying that correctly.
I don't. We don't usually let people unmute. I think, Lisa, if you have a question, please type it in the chat.
So in general, because there's so many people, I think we'll save most of the questions till the end, and then I'm happy to answer any questions that people have. I do want to kind of bring up to begin with, that I know that cannabis can be kind of a hot topic. People feel very strongly about cannabis. I come from Colorado. Originally, I live in Chicago now, but I do come from Colorado, and I deal with this all the time. People have very strong feelings either way. They're very pro-cannabis, very anti-cannabis. And I want to just say upfront, I have no vested interests in cannabis. I'm really interested in it in terms of helping people, and I want to find the best ways that we can help people. And so I'm going off of what we know from the literature. And so that's what I'll be focusing on today. And I just want to kind of make that clear that I have no agenda and I have no personal strong feelings about cannabis. I just want to make sure that people are educated and informed. So I have my PhD in clinical psychology. I'm a licensed clinical psychologist. And so a lot of my time I spend doing research on the brain and trying to understand what are brain and behavioral risk factors for cannabis use and other substance use, especially when that becomes problematic for people. And what are the consequences of use for when people transition to chronic problematic use, especially during adolescence and young adulthood. I also spend my time, today is my clinic day. I was seeing patients this morning and I'll see more patients this afternoon, doing the webinar in between seeing patients. And I see patients in the Recovery Clinic at UIC, which is a clinic that helps to treat individuals with substance use disorders and co-occurring disorders. So I'll get started. I have no conflicts of interest. So for an outline, I'll give a background on cannabis, cannabis use, and cannabis use disorder. I'll talk briefly about the endocannabinoid system. I'll talk about how the endocannabinoid system is implicated and involved in mental health. And then we'll talk about cannabis use in mental health. So first, some background. As most of you may know, cannabis is the most commonly used illegal drug in the US. And although many states in the US have made it legal, either for recreational or medical purposes, on the federal level, it is still an illegal drug. In fact, it's Schedule I, which is the most restricted drug class that there is. Despite it being federally illegal, use is very prevalent of cannabis and use has been increasing. So just to kind of think about who's using cannabis, in 2022, the Monitoring the Future study found that cannabis use reached the highest levels ever recorded among young adults aged 19 to 30 and adults aged 35 to 50. You can see here in this blue line, these are young adults 19 to 30 years old. This is in 1988, the earliest kind of data we have from the Monitoring the Future. And then till 2022. And although there's some variability, you can see, especially in the last 10, 12 years, there's been significant increases in cannabis use prevalence. And that is similar among adults as well, ages 35 to 50, shown here in this red line. So just to kind of show you, this is from April 2023. Hopefully not much has changed since then, but as many of you probably know, cannabis is a very evolving landscape. Things are constantly changing. There's constantly new products that are coming, that my patients are telling me about, or our participants in the study are telling me about. And so as of April 2023, this is a nice map that just shows the states in the United States that have legalized cannabis for either medical or recreational purposes. Medical is in this light blue. You can see some states just have medical legalization, and other states have it for both recreational and medical as well. So the majority of states in the US have legalized it, although it is still a federally illegal drug in the United States. What are the prevalence of use in the United States? Well, the most recent national survey on drug use and health shown that cannabis, of all the illicit substances, is by far the most commonly used illicit substance. In the past year, about 62 million people in the United States used cannabis, far more than many other illicit drugs. And I want to take a second and talk about cannabis, because cannabis is a really complicated, complex plant. You may notice I'm using the term cannabis and not marijuana. There's social reasons to use the term cannabis. It's a more appropriate term for many reasons. And one of the reasons is that cannabis is a really complicated plant. It comes from historically different types of cannabis plants, cannabis indica, cannabis sativa plants. And there are over 500 different compounds that make up cannabis. as a whole is kind of an umbrella term that talks about a lot of different products that are different, are made up of different cannabinoids and compounds. And there's over 100 different cannabinoids in cannabis. And we know very little about most of these compounds and most of these cannabinoids. The two cannabinoids we know the most about are delta-9 THC, which is linked to the addictive, rewarding properties of cannabis, and is linked to when people kind of feel high after using cannabis. That is thought to be a lot of the effects of delta-9 THC. The other cannabinoid that we know some about and is very well known and has become very popular is cannabidiol, or CBD, which is thought to be buffer against some of the negative effects of delta-9 THC. This is important also because the ratio of THC and cannabidiol has drastically changed over the last 30 years, and especially in the last 20 years. So this is a chart showing the ratio, the percentage of THC and CBD. THC is in this red line and CBD is in this blue line here. And this is from the DEA, the Drug Enforcement Agency, samples that they seized. And they kind of characterized what are the percent of THC that we're seeing in cannabis and CBD. And you can see over time, since 1995, some of the earliest data we have, that the percentage has drastically increased from about 4% in the 90s to around 15% THC in cannabis products that are seized. In the meantime, cannabidiol levels have stayed relatively stable throughout that amount of time. So if you think about what I said about the characteristics of cannabidiol and delta-9 THC, delta-9 THC is linked to the addictive, rewarding properties of cannabis. And there's a lot more THC in cannabis now, while CBD really hasn't changed in cannabis. And I want to note this is seized cannabis. So this is kind of some, cannabis you'd buy on the street. Of course, a lot of states now have dispensaries where you can get cannabis, but the percentages of THC and CBD, although some products may vary at dispensaries, in general, the pattern is the same, that a lot of cannabis products, even at dispensaries, have much higher THC ratios. And during this same time that THC potency has really increased in cannabis, we've seen a substantial increase in the abuse liability that's estimated of cannabis. About 10, 15 years ago, it was estimated that about 1 of 10 users would go on to develop problematic use. And some recent estimates suggest that now 3 out of 10 users will go on to develop problematic use. And so we're seeing not just increased use of cannabis, we're also seeing increased incidence of cannabis use disorder. And that might be for various different reasons. But one hypothesis is that the amount of THC, now that it's a much more potent drug, has actually made it a much more addictive drug than it used to be. And if you're thinking about the percentage of THC, this is not even the same drug that the cannabis today that we were talking about in the 90s, in the 80s, and definitely in the 70s. So despite some popular beliefs, cannabis is an addictive substance, and people can meet problematic use or cannabis use disorder by meeting at least 2 of the following symptoms. And these symptoms are consistent across most substance use disorders, and cannabis is not an exception. So if someone has 2 or more of these symptoms, they would meet criteria for cannabis use disorder. Using more or using the substance longer than intended, persistent desire for it, or unsuccessful effort to cut back, spending a lot of time to obtain the substance, use it, or recover from it, craving or desiring it strongly, recurring use despite kind of not being able to fulfill major obligations at work, home, or school. Use continues despite persistent or recurring social interpersonal problems, giving up social, occupational, recreational activities due to use, recurring use in situations that might be physically hazardous, like driving. Use continues despite knowing it causes physical or psychological problems, developing tolerance, so having a diminished effect or needing more to get the same effect, and experiencing withdrawal symptoms or using the substance to avoid them. And cannabis also has withdrawal symptoms for heavy chronic users, including disrupted sleep and some mood disturbances. So what is the prevalence of cannabis use disorder? Well, the National Survey on Drug Use and Health, the most recent one that was published, found that of illicit substance use disorders, cannabis use disorder is by far the most prevalent. In 2022, about 19 million people met criteria for meeting cannabis use disorder in the past year. And this, again, is in the United States. I know we have some people that are, excuse me, from outside of the United States, but this is in the United States. So alcohol use disorder is more prevalent, but barely. So you can tell that a lot of people are meeting criteria for cannabis use disorder. And rates of cannabis use disorder vary across age groups, with young adults 18 to 25 being the group that has the highest prevalence of cannabis use disorder. You can see them in this green line here. 16 to 17% of those individuals meet criteria for cannabis use disorder. This is 12 to 17-year-olds, adolescents, and then 26 and older. And this is overall prevalence in the past year. So let's talk a little bit about the endocannabinoid system. Traditionally, and I'm saying traditionally because it'll get complicated more in a minute, but traditionally the endocannabinoid system is thought to be comprised of cannabinoid 1 and cannabinoid 2 receptors that belong to the family of 7 transmembrane spanning G protein coupled receptors, GPCRs, that are distributed throughout the brain and the body. And you can see in green, cannabinoid 1 receptors kind of distributed throughout the body here. They're mostly in the brain and the central nervous system. They also can be present in nerves and some organs, while CB2 receptors are mostly in the periphery, the peripheral nervous system, and organs in the body, especially in cells associated with the immune system. You can see these in blue here. So what binds to cannabinoid receptors? Well, we talked a little bit about THC, and THC binds to cannabinoid 1 and cannabinoid 2 receptors, and we'll talk about more about that in a minute. We also have endogenous cannabinoids in our body that bind to cannabinoid 1 and cannabinoid 2 receptors, anandamide, AEA, and 2-AG. And these endocannabinoids, unlike a lot of other neurotransmitters, are made on demand in the postsynaptic cell, and they work as retrograde synaptic messengers through binding to CB1 or CB2 receptors in the presynaptic terminal of neurons. Activation of these cannabinoid receptors in turn inhibits the release of many different transmitters, including serotonin, glycine, GABA, glutamate. And so a lot of people think about the endocannabinoid system as a modulator or a regulator of a lot of different neurotransmitter systems. And this will become more relevant as we continue to explore the endocannabinoid system. So turns out that basic understanding of cannabinoid 1 and cannabinoid 2 receptors making up the endocannabinoid system is a little it's a little too simple. They're we are learning more and more about the endocannabinoid system every day compared to a lot of other substances. We actually don't know very much about the endocannabinoid system. So we're learning more, and it turns out it's a lot more complicated than we previously understood. And there's a lot of other receptors, including these orphan G protein coupled receptors, GPR55, GPR18, GPR119, different kind of channels and other receptors and membrane transporters. And I'm not going to get too specific here. We don't have the time to get in the details here, but I'm highlighting this because I think it's important for us to realize how complicated this system is and how much we really don't know about this system. We're just learning more and more about the system every day. And importantly, I talked about how there's over 100 different cannabinoids that make up cannabis. And so if we're thinking about how cannabinoids bind to the endocannabinoid system, it gets really, really complicated because different cannabinoids bind differently to different parts of the endocannabinoid system, which may result in very different actions. And so only THC and THCV, another cannabinoid, are capable of binding with high affinity to CB1 and CB2 receptors. So you can see THC here is an agonist. And so it binds to cannabinoid receptors and maybe other receptors as well, activating those receptors, while another cannabinoid, THCV, is an antagonist. And so it inhibits that receptor, causing very different processes to occur. Meanwhile, cannabidiol, CBD, is binding to other parts of the endocannabinoid system, like PPARs, and maybe disrupting enzymes that break down natural endocannabinoids, SPA, maybe binding and inhibiting other channels or receptors. So I'm bringing this up, and this isn't exactly my expertise in terms of being a basic scientist, but I wanted to really highlight how complicated cannabis and different cannabinoids can be, because they all might have different actions on the endocannabinoid system. And we really know very little. So let's talk about the endocannabinoid system in mental health. So cannabinoids, as we're talking about, bind to the endocannabinoid system in the body that's involved in pain, memory, appetite, mood, stress, sleep, metabolism, immune function, reproductive function. Am I missing functions? I'm saying that as a joke because it is involved in a lot of processes throughout the brain and the body. And it makes it exciting because cannabinoids can regulate or change some of these functions. And so people are excited about the promise that maybe some cannabinoids can really be helpful in helping different disorders or different disruptions that might be occurring. It also is possible that cannabinoids might make some of these processes worse, depending on how strongly they're binding, where they're binding in the system, and the downstream effects that might have. So to date, despite potential for a lot of helpful things that cannabinoids might be able to do, to date, what we know from the literature is that cannabinoids can be effective for reducing chronic pain, especially in some populations. It can be effective for THC can be effective for nausea and vomiting during chemotherapy. It actually has an FDA-approved medication, Marinol, for that purpose. It has been shown in several studies to be helpful in self-reported spasticity and multiple sclerosis. And then in CBD, cannabidiol, has been shown to be helpful and can reduce seizures, especially in rare childhood onset seizure disorders. And there is an FDA-approved medication, Epidiolex, for that purpose. Beyond that, there's really not a lot of evidence for most other purposes that people are using cannabis for. We really are quite limited in our knowledge of how cannabis might be helpful or harmful for a lot of other disorders, and we'll talk more about that. So the endocannabinoid system, going back to our natural endocannabinoid system that's in our brain, is implicated in processes that are very relevant to mental health, one being stress response. So acute exposure to stress rapidly increases corticotropin releasing hormone, and that signaling and that activation of CRH, which binds to CRH receptors, then increases FAAH, which is an enzyme that breaks down AEA, one of the endocannabinoids that naturally occur in our bodies, which in turn decreases AEA, and that decrease in AEA helps to activate the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, the HPA axis, what we often think about in terms of our flight or fight response. And that initiates our body's stress response. So the endocannabinoid system here plays a critical role in that initiation of the stress response. Then, as kind of the stress continues, or our bodies continue to experience that stress, there is high cortisol, and in the brain, high corticosterone levels stimulate the release of 2-AG, so increased 2-AG, and that then kind of contributes to this negative feedback inhibition of the HPA axis, that stress response system, ultimately terminating the stress response. So not only does the endocannabinoid system play a critical role in activating the stress response, it also helps to terminate the stress response. And so both acute and chronic stress can lead to this kind of bidirectional regulation of different endocannabinoids in our bodies, with, in general, acute and chronic stress being associated with decreased AEA and increased 2-AG. Decreased AEA is associated with increased anxiety, increased HPA axis activity, decreased neurogenesis, decreased fear extinction, and might be related to anhedonia. On the other hand, increased 2-AG is implicated in the termination of the HPA axis response to stress. It might result in some HPA axis habituation, some changes in how our stress system responds. It might modulate synaptic plasticity, and is associated with decreased memory retrieval and decreased pain. So in addition to the critical role that the endocannabinoid system contributes in stress, it also plays a critical role in brain reward circuitry, which has large implications as well for a lot of different mental health disorders, including depression, substance use disorders, psychosis. And this shows different regions that are involved in brain reward circuitry, including the striatum, the globus pallidus, and that's connected to the hippocampus and the amygdala. And this figure does a nice job of showing the density of cannabinoid 1 receptors throughout these different brain regions, with the darkest purple being the regions that have the highest density of cannabinoid 1 receptors. So like the globus pallidus has very high density of cannabinoid 1 receptors, whereas the nucleus accumbens has cannabinoid receptors, but the density in this graph is lower. So kind of showing that there's a lot of cannabinoid receptors implicated in different regions involved in brain reward circuitry. And in fact, if we think about the neurotransmitters that are involved in brain reward circuitry, glutamate, GABA, dopamine, and CRF or CRH, cortical-releasing hormone or factor that we were just talking about with the stress system as well, we think about where the systems that the endocannabinoid system modulates the other neurotransmitter systems. And the endocannabinoid system actually regulates and modulates all of these different neurotransmitter systems. And so you can, this kind of highlights just how central the endocannabinoid system is in not only stress response, which we just talked about, but also reward and how our brain responds to reward. And so several different lines of research have supported the role of the endocannabinoid system in reward, and a lot of it showing in animal studies, especially kind of how it supports or maybe implicated in drug-seeking behavior. So THC and other agonists of CB1 receptors have been shown to reinstate the seeking of cannabinoids, opioids, ethanol, nicotine, and cocaine after that behavior has been extinguished. Inversely, cannabinoid 1 antagonists have been shown to attenuate, cue, or drug-induced reinstatement of THC, heroin, ethanol, nicotine, and cocaine. So these kind of lines of evidence show a lot of support for the endocannabinoid system, and especially cannabinoid 1 receptors being really important in how rewarding drugs are and maybe facilitating some drug seeking behavior, not just for cannabis, for other substances as well. There were many different clinical trials that were going on many years ago for an inverse agonist for Monabont it had a lot of promise for metabolic syndrome and smoking cessation. And as some of you may know, all of those clinical trials were halted because of significant psychiatric symptoms that were occurring in participants in these clinical trials, including increased anxiety, depression, suicidal ideation. And so this kind of highlighted how important the endocannabinoid system and cannabinoid 1 receptors specifically are in mood and anxiety and kind of other symptoms of other mental health disorders. There's been a growing interest in looking at other types of cannabinoids, whether they're synthetic or natural, that might change food intake and reward seeking. And so some neutral agonists have been looked at, like THCV, and there's some evidence showing that that might help to modulate food intake for people who have problems with weight or maybe need help with reducing food intake and reward seeking. So as you can see, there's a lot of different converging evidence that the endocannabinoid system is implicated in mental health. And it's been implicated in a lot of different mental health disorders, including mood disorders, anxiety disorders, stress disorders, and psychosis. So some animal studies have shown that reduced endocannabinoid signaling may contribute to anhedonic depression. And so the inhibition or removal of cannabinoid 1 receptors in rodents has resulted in decreased motivation to consume sucrose, which is very rewarding to rodents, while activation of cannabinoid 1 receptors in rodents results in the inverse, increased sucrose drinking, kind of again highlighting this critical role that cannabinoid 1 receptors play in reward seeking, but now switching from substance use and other drug-seeking behaviors to anhedonia, the lack of ability to feel reward, which is one of the core symptoms of depression. Another line of evidence shows that cannabinoid 1 manipulation has bidirectional effects on anxiety behavior. This is very strong in the animal literature, and there's also growing support in human literature for this as well, such that cannabinoid 1 activation decreases anxiety at lower doses. So, for example, low doses of THC might acutely decrease anxiety. But if you increase the dose and you give someone a high THC product, or an animal a high THC product, or another cannabinoid that activates cannabinoid 1 receptors, there is increased anxiety, anxiogenic effects that also occurs after a cannabinoid 1 blockade. In humans, when looking at just serum levels of different endocannabinoids, AEA and 2-AG, there's been some evidence that there might be lower 2-AG in individuals with major depressive disorder compared to matched controls. So their endocannabinoid system might be functioning differently. And in another population, they found higher AEA in untreated and treated patients with schizophrenia compared to controls. And I guess they also looked at individuals at risk for psychosis. And this just all highlights the role that the endocannabinoid system may play in a lot of different mental health disorders. So let's move on to cannabis use and mental health. And I want to start by kind of just addressing some cannabis use controversies. I mentioned at the beginning that cannabis is a hot topic and people feel very strongly about cannabis. And I'm, people often are telling me different things that cannabis can do. And I'm really excited to be here today to kind of just show you, I have no interests in either way, whether I think cannabis and different cannabinoids could be potentially beneficial. I think they can also be harmful. I don't have any invested interest either way. But I wanted to share with you what the evidence tells us. And so far, there's really inconclusive negative data or no data for many different medicinal uses, despite what people say in the popular press, despite what people tell you at dispensaries. There's not a lot of data to support most of the reasons that people are using cannabis for medicinal purposes. So many of my patients come in and tell me that they use cannabis to help with anxiety or depression. And that might be true, that it's helping with anxiety or depression acutely. I think that there's evidence to support that. Unfortunately, over time, we know from the literature that cannabis use exacerbates anxiety symptoms and it exacerbates depression over time when people are using it chronically and regularly. And so I want to highlight that because so many people use cannabis for anxiety and depression, and there might be different cannabinoids that might be helpful long-term for that. We don't know yet, and that is really the take-home message. We don't know yet. There's a lot of regulatory issues in cannabis use, especially given that it's a federal one. It's a federally illegal Schedule I drug. So one issue, and I deal with this often, is barriers to research. It's very difficult to study cannabis and different cannabinoids, given that on the federal level, it's still deemed to be illegal. And not just illegal Schedule I, which is very difficult, has a lot of restrictions around it. Potency, as we talked about, THC continues to increase in a lot of different cannabinoid products. And that leads into this accuracy of labels at dispensaries. Some people, depending on the local or state government, this is in the US, there's varying degrees of oversight and regulation. You know, I've heard some stories that the same product is sent to 2 different labs and people get very different results in how much THC is in that same product. Again, these are anecdotes. I don't have evidence for that. But, you know, there's, because it's federally illegal, there's a lot of regulatory issues that come at play that make it difficult for us as scientists, for us as clinicians, to understand all of the benefits or harms from cannabis and different cannabinoids. I want to just quickly raise some public health issues. As cannabis use is increasing and rates of cannabis use disorder are increasing, we are especially interested and want to be careful about cannabis use among vulnerable populations, like adolescents, and I'll talk about that in a minute, and also among pregnant individuals. There's growing rates of cannabis use among pregnant populations, and there's some concern around that. There has been shown to be some increased risk of motor vehicle crashes. Some studies show poor cognitive functioning in users. That does get better as people stop using and have a period of abstinence. But while they're using, there is some evidence for poor cognitive functioning. And there is some growing evidence around worse respiratory symptoms and more chronic bronchitis episodes linked to regular chronic use. I want to talk a little bit about the co-occurrence of cannabis use and mental health disorders. This is, again, more data from the National Survey on Drug Use and Health, such a fantastic survey, showing in adolescents the prevalence of past year cannabis use here among individuals who had an episode of major depression in the last year. This is here in blue, and among individuals who did not have an episode of major depression episode. And you can see a significant majority of individuals, these are adolescents, 12 to 17, who used cannabis in the past year, had depression as well in the past year. We also see the same pattern, not just with depression, but with mental illness in general among adults aged 18 or older from the same survey. So when asked about who's using cannabis in the past year, the majority of individuals either in the blue had any mental illness or serious mental illness. And so it's really important to consider why different individuals are using cannabis, and really important to think about the benefits or harms that might come from using cannabis among individuals who have psychiatric disorders, mental health illness. So thinking about kind of cannabis use motives, one of the most commonly cited and common reason that a lot of people think about for using substances, and cannabis included, is a self-medication hypothesis. Using a substance like cannabis to reduce negative affect, reduce feelings of anxiety, of depression, etc. And there's been a lot of evidence to suggest that that might be the case for cannabis. Many people who have high negative affect use cannabis to relieve negative affect, and that might be related to use. Recently, a fantastic clinical psychology intern in my lab, Katie Page, put together all different elements of the self-medication hypothesis to show that among individuals who are late adolescents and young adults, those who have high negative affect and who have difficulty tolerating distress, so low distress tolerance, they are more likely to use cannabis to cope with negative affect, and they have more frequent cannabis use. Kind of shown a different way, for those with low negative affect, distress tolerance, how you tolerate distress when you're feeling stressed and the experience is you're kind of feeling distressed. It doesn't change your coping motives, why you would use cannabis to cope with negative affect. But among those with high negative affect, those who have low distress tolerance have higher motives for using cannabis to cope with negative affect. And like I said, they have more cannabis use. They use more frequently, showing that there is even more support for the self-medication hypothesis. Among those, I want to kind of make sure that I don't say this for everyone, because it's not the case that this is for everyone. This is for individuals who have high negative affect and low distress tolerance. On the other hand, a lot of people use cannabis to feel good, to boost their mood, to kind of, whether that's in isolation or with friends. And we know that cannabis plays, oops, sorry. I got a notification and went out of my screen for a second. Sorry about that. I'm back. So we know that one of the main reasons people report not just to relieve negative affect, but to boost positive affect, to want to feel good, to hang out with friends. And so not only does affect matter, but social context matters. And an amazing graduate student who I work with, who is also mentored by my colleague, Robin Mermelstein, she found for her master's project this really elegant design where she used ecological momentary assessment with a big group of individuals, adults who use cannabis, and they reported about their affect in their daily life after using cannabis and during times when they didn't use cannabis. And what she found was that positive affect is elevated after kind of using cannabis, regardless of social context. So it didn't matter where people were alone or were with other people. But negative affect really mattered who you were with. So negative affect was reduced at cannabis use times when individuals were with others, but it was increased at cannabis use when individuals were alone. And this really highlights that cannabis can have different effects on someone's mood depending on who they're with and where they're at, potentially. She also found that higher cannabis use disorder symptoms were related to less negative affect at cannabis use times, showing support for that self-medication hypothesis, especially among individuals who have greater problematic use. They might feel less negative affect after using cannabis, and that might be why they use cannabis more frequently, perhaps. I wanted to also kind of talk about one other recent study that found that depression symptoms might also change how much of a positive affect boost you get after using cannabis, especially high THC cannabis. This study found that individuals with higher depression symptoms felt more positive affect after using a THC-dominant cannabis product than individuals with lower depression symptoms, showing that the composition of cannabis matters, and also kind of your baseline mood, whether that's depression, and I don't know if someone's looked at anxiety as well yet, but that all might contribute to the positive mood benefits or the negative mood benefits that people feel when they're using. So most of substance use occurs during adolescence and young adulthood, or at least begins then. In our society, it is very normative to use substances during adolescence and young adulthood. In fact, the majority of the US population will use alcohol or cannabis at least once during adolescence and young adulthood. And so we want to think about what are potential harmful effects in this vulnerable population. And so when thinking about adolescents, what makes this population especially vulnerable and makes us have some pause for concern about substance use in general and for cannabis use included in that is that the brain is undergoing rapid neurodevelopment during adolescence. So this is a wonderful figure from a study a little while ago, but shows that the trajectory of gray matter development in the brain. This is from age 5 to age 20. And you can see the purple represents more mature gray matter. The brain matures from the back to the front, from the bottom to the top. So if you're thinking about back to front, bottom to top, around age 20 is when the gray matter is thought to have mostly matured. And if you notice, the prefrontal cortex involved in decision-making, impulsivity, regulation is the last part of the brain to develop. This is gray matter. White matter, which connects all of the different regions of the brain, is thought to not fully develop until the mid-20s. So if someone's using substances during this time, it is thought that that might disrupt neurodevelopment and might perhaps create some structural brain abnormalities, functional brain abnormalities, and perhaps poorer cognitive function. And importantly, the endocannabinoid system plays a critical role in neuromaturation and synaptic pruning. And so if someone is using cannabis during this time, they are disrupting the way that the endocannabinoid system naturally functions, and that might change the way that neuromaturation and synaptic pruning is happening in the brain, because the endocannabinoid system plays a critical role in neuromaturation. And indeed, animal studies show that THC exposure during adolescence can have lasting functional and structural brain changes. So we want to be really thoughtful about adolescent and young adult cannabis use during this kind of sensitive time. I mentioned before, cannabinoid receptors in a lot of different regions of the brain. They're densely concentrated in the prefrontal cortex, which we talked about in terms of executive functioning, the basal ganglia involved in motivation, reward, very relevant to a lot of different mental health disorders, the midbrain, arousal, sensory functions, motivation, motor responses, the thalamus, stress response, memory, metabolic processes, the hippocampus, learning and memory, and the amygdala, a memory emotional functioning. So again, to highlight the different areas of the brain, not just implicated in different cognitive processes, but also in a lot of the mental health disorders that we think about. So what do we know about regular cannabis use, especially during adolescence and young adulthood? Well, it's linked to poor school performance and increased dropout rates, increased risk for later psychotic disorder in adulthood, and I'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. Increased symptoms of affective disorders, major depressive disorder, bipolar disorder, anxiety and personality disorders, increased suicidal ideation and suicide attempts, increased prevalence of nearly all other substance use, and increased sexual risk behaviors, increased disability in adulthood. So there's a lot of evidence to suggest that cannabis use during adolescence and young adulthood has a lot of negative consequences. And so the more that we can delay use, the better. I wanted to focus a little bit on, in the last the portion of this talk, on the growing evidence and link between cannabis use and psychosis. Personally, and in the clinic I work in, we are seeing many more referrals for individuals who have psychosis, and it is thought to be linked to cannabis use, especially young adult males. And there's growing evidence that this might be the case. So I wanted to walk through this consensus paper that is a recent paper that is a fantastic paper that was put together, kind of showing this, the evidence for this link between cannabis use and psychosis. So one of the symptoms of being acutely intoxicated with cannabis, especially high THC cannabis, is psychosis, hearing hallucinations, having paranoia. And so kind of this onset of psychosis immediately following exposure. And this might be more for certain individuals, but it's brief during intoxication. And then for some individuals that might last longer. So the onset of psychosis immediately following exposure, but it lasts longer than intoxication. And then for some individuals that persists and perhaps even reoccurs and might lead to a psychosis spectrum disorder like schizophrenia. So this kind of is this figure from this paper showing on the x-axis, you can see the incident rate ratio of psychosis. And this on the x-axis, you can see the year. And this is a study from Denmark. And it shows the increased incidence of psychosis kind of parallels the increases in THC potency in cannabis products. So kind of using this as this reference line around 2006, when potency of THC products in Denmark really started to increase. At the same time, you see they found this almost threefold increase in the incidence rate of psychosis. And so just kind of supporting this hypothesis that high THC cannabis can increase the risk of psychosis. And breaking it down even further, they show that the more frequently people use and the higher potency cannabis people use, the greater the risk is for psychosis. And so these are odds ratios on the y-axis, and on the x-axis, it goes from never used to kind of rarely used, and this is low THC cannabis, high THC cannabis, used more than once a week, again, low THC cannabis, high THC cannabis, and then used daily, low THC cannabis, high THC cannabis. And you can kind of see this general trend where the more you use, especially daily, and the higher THC content is in the cannabis that you're using, the greater the risk is for psychosis. And there's also evidence to suggest that earlier age of initiated use is also a risk factor for that as well. So I've talked a lot about THC, and I want to talk about some other cannabinoids too, in the last few minutes that we have. In general, I mentioned at the beginning, we know very little about a lot of other cannabinoids. The other cannabinoid we know some more about is cannabidiol, CBD. And that has really in the US become, you can find it everywhere. The 2018 Farm Bill that was passed categorized cannabis, they characterized cannabis versus hemp. And so cannabis is kind of characterized as greater than 0.3% delta-9 THC by dry weight. And it, as I mentioned, is federally legal and regulated by states that have policies in place. And on the other hand, the Farm Bill legalized hemp, and it is defined as less than 0.3% delta-9 THC by dry weight. And it is regulated federally as an agricultural plant. And so this has, there's been a huge surge in the amount of cannabidiol and CBD products that can be found everywhere. At the corner store, you see drinks with CBD on it, with CBD in it. It also kind of puts a lot of these different cannabinoids in this gray area, delta-9 THC, delta-8 THC, and delta-9 THC being, there's this gray area, like, does it really fall under cannabis or does it fall under hemp? Sometimes that's not always clear. Cannabidiol, CBN, CBG, and they're kind of in this gray area where they're not necessarily legal always, but they're not really regulated either. And I just wanted to share this anecdote, how available some of these products are. I asked my husband to get me a cookie a couple of months ago, and I live in Chicago, and he went and bought this cookie for me, and he brought it home, and my 4-year-old was with me, and he was so excited, and he wanted the cookie. And I was about to give him the cookie and I turned it over. And as you can see here, there's no labels or anything. All of a sudden, I turn it over and I'm like, oh my goodness, this has 20 milligrams of CBD in it. And so I had to tell my 4-year-old son I couldn't give it to him. And I'm so grateful that I saw this label, but I'm just kind of highlighting how prolific a lot of these products are. And they're not always, this is part of this regulation issue that there's no regulation necessarily depending on your local or state governments about how these products are labeled. Luckily, I had an ingredient list and I was paying attention. So what are the effects of cannabidiol on different mental health disorders? A lot of people use cannabidiol for depression and anxiety, and there's a few studies showing some effects, but not many. A recent graduate student of mine who I mentioned earlier, Rebecca Dunson, she put together the systematic review article on clinical and preclinical research looking at how does cannabidiol impact depressive and anxiety disorders. And the evidence told us that in preclinical studies, in animal studies, there's evidence that it really is mixed. Actually, the evidence is mixed that CBD effects on depression-like behavior kind of differ by sex, early life stress, duration of use. And there's been no human studies on the effect of cannabidiol on depression to date. Cannabidiol may reduce symptoms of anxiety in adolescents and young adults, especially for social anxiety disorder. But there's a few studies, and we definitely need more. And there was no evidence for the same effect in adolescent preclinical animal studies. So we need a lot more research to understand the potential benefits or harms of cannabidiol for depression and anxiety disorders. A lot of people are using it, and we really don't have the evidence base to support these decisions or tell people, hey, hold on, that may not be the best thing for you. So in conclusion, cannabis use is prevalent in the US, especially among young adults. Cannabis use has changed drastically over the past 40 years. The endocannabinoid system is involved in many processes, including mood, stress, reward, sleep, immune function. The endocannabinoid system is implicated in many, I guess I said that twice, health disorders, including mood disorders, anxiety disorders, stress disorders, and psychosis. And regular cannabis use, especially during adolescence and young adulthood, is associated with several negative health and mental health outcomes, with higher THC cannabis associated with higher risk. And we really know very little about other cannabinoids, so we need a lot more research to better understand this. This is my lab at the University of Illinois at Chicago, and I want to thank NIDA for funding some of the studies I'm involved in. So thank you. I'd love to take any questions that people might have.
Thank you so much, Dr. Crane. We do have a few questions. I'm hoping that we can get to all of them, but probably not. We have a few here.
Okay.
I'm just going to start at the top here. Does any of the research on increased use account for both increased state level legalization and an increased willingness to disclose use in legal states?
Does the research support the increase in legalization? Is that the
Does
question?
research on increased use account for both increased state level legalization and increased willingness to disclose use in legal states?
Oh, that one's a tough one, and it really kind of depends on, there's so much variability across states. I don't know that I could say that on a general level.
Okay, thank you. Okay, I'm going to massacre this word, but I'm going to try here. Can you please speak about the use of N-acetylcysteine and its chemical role in facilitating recovery from cannabis abuse?
That is something I'd have to look up. I don't know that off the top of my head. So I would have to go to the literature and look that up.
Okay, perfect. The next one is RE stress response. What is the time duration for when you say rapid response versus delayed response?
Good question for the stress. So that really varies by individual, but our bodies aren't able to handle acute stress for a long period of time. So usually around 15, 20 minutes, we're talking about in terms of that. I really was talking about an acute stressor that happens and your body's response to that acute stressor. Now, depending on how many stressors you have, that could change those systems and kind of dysregulate your stress response system over time, changing how that is responding.
Okay, the next question is, so would this research then provide support for the idea that marijuana/cannabis use being a gateway drug for other drugs?
There is some evidence to suggest that. There's also evidence to suggest that things like nicotine and cigarette use are really or alcohol are some of the first substances that people use. But cannabis is this really evolving, changing landscape. And so a lot of the studies that were done so many years ago, longitudinal studies. And at that point, cannabis wasn't legalized for medical or recreational reasons yet. And so we're in the cannabis research field, we're always trying to stay up to date, but the field is constantly changing. So it makes it hard for us to always know the answer to those questions.
Okay. Is there not a lot of medical data because there hasn't been any significant longitudinal testing for this kind of data versus anecdotal evidence?
For which kind of data?
Do you want me to reread that again?
Yes, please.
Okay, is there not a lot of medicinal data because there has not been any significant longitudinal testing for this kind of data, or has there been versus anecdotal evidence?
There are some studies for particular disorders, especially data for like spasticity and multiple sclerosis. There's data for chronic pain. But in a lot of other disorders, there's not good data to support medicinal use of a lot of different cannabinoids.
Okay. How does it affect people who are on antidepressants and antipsychotic medications?
We don't know the answer to that. There is this growing link that I talked about between cannabis use and psychosis. In fact, I saw one patient earlier today who has been admitted several times after what we think is cannabis-induced psychosis, but it's not always easy to tease apart that. And so we do see a growing in our clinic and also in the literature, this growing link between cannabis use and psychosis. So it potentially, from the literature, it makes symptoms of depression worse over time if you're using regularly, especially high THC cannabis, and the same for psychosis.
Okay, thank you. The next question is, are there any differences between the impacts from smoking vaping THC products versus traditional smoking?
Really good question. Yeah, we don't know that yet. I'm working on a study with my colleague Robin Mermelstein on nicotine and cannabis co-use, and we're looking at that, but it's not a direct comparison between smoked cannabis and electronic nicotine delivery systems, which a lot of people use for cannabis use as well. So that's a really fascinating question, and we don't know that yet, to my knowledge.
Okay, thank you. The next question is, I am curious about the quote, which one came first, unquote, regarding youth with MHD and drug use. Did it cause depression or did depression lead to them using?
If someone could answer that, they would get a lot of funding or accolades. That's been a constant debate in the literature. There's evidence for both directions, that depression caused cannabis use and cannabis use caused depression. I think that we're talking about in mental health illness, and in different disorders, they're heterogeneous disorders. We've lumped them together because symptom profiles look similar, right? But people get to those disorders and they develop disorders through different pathways, different life experiences. So I think that for some people, it might be that depression comes first and then they use cannabis. And for others, it might be that cannabis comes first and then they experience depression.
Okay, thank you. Could you talk about exposure to cannabis and how it influences children and families? Are there any safe storage and use guidelines, and what is the best practice?
That is such an important question. There's been increasing rates of emergency room visits for children who've ingested cannabis products. And if you've been to a dispensary, you know a lot of the products look like candy or, brownies, gummies, lollipops. And so kids find them and then they take them, and that can cause some really adverse outcomes. And so I think it's really important that parents, if they're using cannabis, they find a lockbox, they find some way to store it safely that their kids cannot reach. I don't know of any guidelines that have been published, but that's a really important question, and we should have those guidelines. So yeah, I'll look into that.
Hey, are there any studies on any correlation between long-term THC use and the increased risk of developing dementia?
Oh, there are not to my knowledge. There is a lot of people using cannabis who have dementia or their caretakers use cannabis. And so I'm actually working on a project that hopefully gets funded to look at that. I think it's getting reviewed today, so cross your fingers for us to look at that question, not longitudinally, but just in individuals with dementia and their caretakers. In general, a lot of the evidence suggests that cannabis use during adulthood after development is, I guess we never stop developing, but after neurodevelopment really finishes and we're kind of our brain's considered to be fully mature around the mid-20s. Use after that isn't necessarily associated with a lot of adverse outcomes. Of course, there are exceptions to that, but on average, the earlier you use in development, especially during adolescence and young adulthood, the worse outcomes. There have not been any studies that have followed people for that long to understand dementia risk, but use among adults and older adults who didn't start in adolescence and young adulthood has not been shown to be as harmful.
Okay. To your knowledge, are there negative effects after the use of CBD ointment for knee pain in adults with no SUD disorders?
Anecdotally, I've heard a lot of support for that idea. I don't know the literature on that as much, so I'd have to look into that. Yeah, I'm not sure.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. We do not have any other questions. If anybody else out there has any questions, put in the chat. If you could do that right now. Here's one more we'll take here. Any idea if topical THC for pain actually goes into the blood?
That is a really good question, and I wish I knew the answer to that. I think, there's support for that, but I would have to go and look to see in the literature to see if there's been studies to know that either way. But we know the skin absorbs things, so of course you would think that it potentially could get into the blood, but I don't know the answer to that.
Pat, I see you in the chat. You said you put 2 questions, and I'm so sorry. I do not see your questions. If you can put them in the chat really quick. I'll give you a minute to do that. Okay, he's going to type in his questions really quick. If we can just give him a second. I don't want to miss any questions here. These are all pretty important questions.
Mhm.
Okay, okay, here's Pat's questions. Why is the term cannabis preferred?
Good question. So, some people believe the term marijuana can have some derogatory meanings. So some people, that is a reason for some people not to use it. There's also the reason that marijuana usually refers to dried buds, stems, leaves from the cannabis sativa plant. It's kind of more specific, and just refers to certain types of cannabis products, while cannabis is more of like an umbrella term of a lot of different products, if that makes sense, that marijuana might fall under if you want to use that term.
Okay. We're going to answer one more here for the sake of time and so that you can get off and get going here. This last question is, does cannabis have any impact on ADHD?
Yes, there's a huge prevalence comorbidity of ADHD and cannabis use. And like the other mental health disorders, it seems as though more use is related to worse outcomes, especially during adolescence and young adulthood. One thing that cannabis does is that it acutely, and depending how regularly someone uses, it can have some lingering effects if someone's a chronic regular user. It decreases attention, it decreases learning, and it decreases working memory. And so if you think about those 3 cognitive processes, they are hugely important when you're thinking about ADHD, the ability to organize, to remember, to structure. And so and also, I should have mentioned executive functioning skills might be, there's debate on what came, the chicken and the egg, what came first, deficits in executive functioning or cannabis use. But if you have some problems with organization, with planning, with impulsivity, it is possible that cannabis can not only make your attention and learning and working memory worse, it might also make impulsivity, planning, organization worse as well.
Thank you. I do have one more important question to ask you that are important here. What are common, if you can, what are common withdrawal symptoms from cannabis use, and what do you foresee about the federal classification of cannabis in the future?
Common withdrawal symptoms are disrupted sleep and increased depression and anxiety. And that usually is most prevalent in the first 2 weeks after someone has stopped using regularly. It can go on for about a month after someone has stopped using regularly. Those two symptoms are usually and craving, but I think that the most disruptive to a lot of people are sleep and increases in anxiety, increases in depression after stop using. And then about the cannabis legalization, rescheduling, but that is, I have no idea what they're going to do with rescheduling. Your guess is probably as good as mine.
Sure. All right. Thank you so much, Dr. Crane, for this wonderful presentation. It was very educational, so much information. Everybody in the chat is thanking you for all of the great information. We would love to have you back sometime. Thank you again for everything, and we hope that you have a great rest of your week.
Yeah, thank you
Everyone.
all. Really loved all your questions and appreciate you listening. Would love to come back.